power is usually conceived of as something bold, loud and clear. We imagine kings issuing orders over armies, emperors forging empires, or presidents delivering speeches that reverberate across the globe. But the past has a different tale to tell, one that is more low-key, behind the scenes, and no less potent. Behind each throne was a player who did not claim the crown, but sometimes pulled the strings more than we are aware of. These were the consorts, wives of monarchs who were relegated to being ornamental or secondary figures, but who in fact defined dynasties, altered directions for policies, and shifted the directions of nations in ways recorded only in cryptic hints in official histories. Imagine a royal court with whispers, where resolutions made behind closed doors counted for more than declarations made in public places. A single discussion at midnight might decide whether a kingdom went to war or brokered peace. A masterminded marriage might bring together warring forces or plant the seeds of centuries of strife. A consort's guidance could calm a reckless sovereign, or their ambition could push a dynasty into chaos. These subtle acts of influence, invisible to many at the time, left legacies that are still with us centuries later. What is interesting about these tales is not just the magnitude of their influence, but the manner in which they point to a different kind of power. One that is not a matter of issuing commands or enacting legislation, but of creating the context within which choices are made. It was a power embodied in persuasion, patience, and presence. The queen who employed patronage of the arts to secure her family's reputation, the prince who agitated for change in secret, the dowager who ruled as regent to defend her child's throne. Such women were not silent attendants. They were behind-the-scenes architects constructing futures to which they themselves were rarely accorded credit. And it is not only about history. These tales resonate today because the same patterns of influence are repeated in contemporary politics, culture, and even individual lives. We continue to witness spouses of leaders questioned for their influence, confidants influencing policy behind closed doors, and advisors who might never show up on a ballot but chart the courses of nations. The history lessons are not faraway curiosities. They are mirrors of realities about human power that are as close to the present as they were in the past centuries. So why do these numbers still fascinate us? Perhaps because they reveal that history is never solely about the immediately obvious rulers, those with names that crowd textbooks. It's also about the ones who labored in the shadows, who recognized that real power oftentimes remains out of sight, and who demonstrated that influence without fame can sometimes be the most lasting of all. Their tales compel us to examine anew what it is to exercise power and remind us that the shadow of the crown may be as significant as the crown. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time, and in this video, we are going to uncover the untold world of royal consorts, their hidden influence, their daring strategies, and the legacies they left behind that continue to shape our world today. Throughout history, monarchs have often been studied as singular figures whose strength, weakness, or vision shaped kingdoms. Kings, queens regnant, emperors, and empresses dominate the written record. Yet surrounding them were individuals who shared their chambers, dined at their side, and sometimes counseled them in private moments when no ministers or generals were near. These individuals, the consorts, were not passive companions. They lived at the heart of power, and though they were rarely credited with shaping the fate of nations, many of them played decisive roles in the course of political events. To understand monarchy without acknowledging their presence is to see only half the picture. The shadows cast by crowns were wide, and within those shadows consorts stood, often unseen, influencing not only their partners but entire dynasties. The neglect of consorts in mainstream history owes much to the way chronicles were written. Traditional accounts focused on public acts, battles fought, treaties signed, proclamations read aloud. Consorts often worked in spaces that left fewer obvious records. Their influence was woven into private conversation, family alliances, the subtleties of succession, and the shaping of court factions. Chroniclers, usually male and tied to institutions that emphasized the authority of the sovereign, found it easier to ignore or downplay the roles of those whose power was neither official nor straightforward. Yet if one looks closely at letters, diaries, ambassadorial reports, and even the gossip of courtiers, the presence of consorts emerges as constant and sometimes decisive. The influence of a consort often began with marriage itself. These unions were rarely private matters of affection. They were political arrangements designed to link dynasties, secure peace, or open trade. By marrying a daughter of a powerful foreign house, a monarch could tie his realm to distant allies. This brought into the court a woman who arrived with her own retinue, her own expectations, and the backing of her family abroad. Sometimes she was regarded with suspicion, particularly if she belonged to a rival power, but that suspicion did not erase the fact that she became the mother of future heirs and the closest partner to the ruler. From this central position, she could act both as mediator between her family of birth and her new kingdom, and as a quiet architect of strategies that shaped the realm. One reason consorts could wield such influence lies in the intimacy of their role. Ministers, generals, and courtiers could be dismissed. Foreign ambassadors could be ignored. A consort, sharing the sovereign's private space, had a kind of access no one else could claim. Nightly conversations, moments of vulnerability, the privacy of shared meals, all became occasions where counsel might be offered. Even the most independent monarch could not escape the presence of a partner who lived within the same walls and shared in the burdens of daily life. In such settings, consorts could temper rash decisions, encourage bold action, or nurture suspicions that changed the course of policy. Despite this, consorts often appear in history as footnotes. The reasons are not mysterious. Chroniclers were often unwilling to admit that decisions attributed to kings were shaped by those who slept beside them. To acknowledge that a queen consort's advice carried weight risked diminishing the image of sovereign authority. Furthermore, influence that relied on subtle persuasion rather than direct command was difficult to trace. But absence from the official record is not proof of absence in reality. Many rulers leaned heavily on their spouses, and in several cases, the voice of the consort was the deciding factor in questions of war, peace. The shaping of succession is one of the most important, yet overlooked arenas where consorts left their mark. Children of the sovereign and consort were the future of dynasties, and a mother's concern for the position of her own offspring was natural. The struggle to secure a son's or daughter's claim often demanded both patience and ruthless strategy. Consorts sometimes maneuvered to discredit rivals within the family, lobbied ministers to support a particular heir, or persuaded the sovereign to favor one child over another. The so-called myth of the kingmaker is rooted in reality. Many consorts were exactly that, makers and shapers of future monarchs, ensuring that their line rather than another branch inherited the crown. History offers numerous examples of this. In medieval Europe, where rival claimants abounded, a consort's skill in defending her child's rights could decide the outcome of succession disputes. When a sovereign hesitated or faced pressure from powerful nobles, it was often the consort who acted decisively to protect her offspring's position. She might build alliances among courtiers, secure promises from influential bishops, or draw upon her natal family abroad to intimidate or cajole. In effect, the future of dynasties often depended not solely on the ruler, but on the quiet determination of the ruler's spouse. The shaping of power by consorts did not stop with family matters. Many were directly involved in the affairs of state. In some cases, when a monarch was absent at war or incapacitated by illness, the consort acted as regent. This was not merely a ceremonial role. Regents made real decisions, commanded armies, levied taxes, and negotiated treaties. Even when not formally regent, some consorts influenced the composition of councils, determined which ministers held office, or advised on appointments to the church. A sovereign might outwardly appear to dominate the stage, but the script was often influenced by the hand of the consort behind the curtain. Consider the way in which consorts could determine policy through patronage. Court politics often revolved around favor. To gain advancement, nobles and courtiers sought not only the sovereign's goodwill, but also that of the consort. By lending her support to one faction over another, a consort could shift the balance of power within the court. This patronage extended to artists, writers, and thinkers as well. The cultural image of a reign, what art was created, what ideals were celebrated, was often shaped by the tastes and values of the consort. Influence over culture is never trivial. It framed how monarchs were remembered and how subjects understood their rulers. Some consorts went further still, stepping into roles usually reserved for men. In times of crisis, there are accounts of consorts rallying armies, addressing troops, or even appearing on the battlefield. Their very presence could inspire loyalty, for soldiers saw in them the embodiment of dynastic continuity. If the sovereign was absent or dead, the consort's authority could preserve order until a successor was secure. Though often overlooked, such moments reveal that the line between companion and ruler could blur dramatically when necessity demanded it. It is worth asking why so many of these figures remain in the shadows. One answer lies in the discomfort with female authority that marked much of recorded history. Chroniclers, trained to see men as actors and women as dependents, were reluctant to ascribe power to consorts. Even when their influence was undeniable, it was often described in negative terms, as manipulation or meddling. Male consorts of reigning queens faced a different but similar erasure. Their role was often minimized to avoid suggesting that the queen regnant was dependent on her husband. In both cases, gendered expectations led to a distortion of the historical record, minimizing the presence of consorts who were in fact vital players. When we speak of unseen architects of power, then we are describing not only the consorts themselves but also the way history has been written to obscure their place. To recover their influence requires piecing together scattered evidence. Letters that reveal intimate counsel, records of patronage, notes from foreign envoys who observed who whispered in the sovereign's ear, or the sequence of appointments that suggest behind-the-scenes intervention. When one gathers this evidence, a different picture emerges. Monarchs appear not as solitary figures but as partners in power, sharing authority, sometimes willingly, sometimes grudgingly, with those closest to them. The complexity of these partnerships defies simple judgment. Some consorts use their influence to stabilize kingdoms, preventing rash decisions and preserving peace. Others deepened factional conflict, encouraging suspicion and rivalry that tore courts apart. Some advanced culture and learning, while others enriched their families at the expense of the realm. To paint them all with one brush would be misleading. What they shared was proximity to power, and with that proximity came opportunities that most subjects could scarcely imagine. In many ways, the story of consorts is a reminder that politics is not only a matter of official acts, but of personal relationships. A sovereign's marriage was not simply a private union, but a central political fact. The emotions, loyalties, and ambitions that shaped that marriage inevitably spilled over into the governance of the state. Historians who ignore this dimension risk misunderstanding the nature of monarchy itself. The crown was visible, but its shadow was cast by those who stood beside it, often hidden yet profoundly influential. In every age, people speculated about the role of consorts. Gossip about their power filled courts, and ambassadors wrote detailed reports back to their masters about the sway a queen or prince consort might hold. Sometimes this speculation exaggerated reality, creating myths of manipulation where none existed. At other times, the gossip barely hinted at the full extent of a consort's role. What remains consistent is that contemporaries themselves sensed the importance of consorts. They may have mocked, feared, or admired them, but they never dismissed them as irrelevant. The idea of the sovereign as an isolated figure of destiny is a powerful one, but it is incomplete. Behind every ruler stood those who shared their private world, whose voices were heard when no one else's could be. The legacy of consorts, then, is not merely decorative. They were participants in the making of history, shaping dynasties, guiding policies, and sometimes defending the very survival of the state. Their names may not always appear in the headlines of chronicles, but without them the story of monarchy cannot be fully told. From this vantage point, one must examine the role of marriages themselves, for the union that bound a ruler to a consort was never only personal. It was almost always a calculated alliance, devised through careful negotiation and pursued with political purpose. More than romance, these unions were strategies stitched into the very fabric of international relations. The courtship of monarchs was not a matter of hearts meeting across a ballroom, but of dynasties meeting across borders. Each proposal carried implications for trade routes, territorial claims, and military alliances. A single union could secure peace between realms or ignite rivalries that smoldered for generations. Marriages of state were sometimes discussed in terms of diplomacy, yet they reached further than treaties written on parchment. A treaty could be broken when interests shifted, but a marriage was a living connection, embodied in the person of the consort and renewed each day in the bonds of family. When a princess traveled from her homeland to wed a king or prince in a distant realm, she brought not only her dowry, but also the expectations of her native court, the watchful eyes of her kin, and the constant reminder that her body would bear heirs whose blood joined two dynasties. This living bond often proved more enduring than a signature on a document. For the consort, however, such unions demanded a careful balancing act. She was at once a foreigner and a new figurehead of the nation she had entered. Her accent, her customs, Even her taste in dress could mark her as an outsider. Courts were notoriously suspicious of foreigners, fearing that they might secretly work in favor of their natal families rather than their adopted country. Xenophobia was no modern invention. It coursed through palace halls, whispered in courtiers' conversations, and filled pamphlets that mocked or maligned foreign queens. Yet those who endured and overcame such suspicion often did so by mastering the art of adaptation. A successful consort learned to speak the language of her new subjects, to adopt their traditions, and to patronize their religious and cultural institutions. By doing so, she demonstrated loyalty to her adopted land while still retaining her connections abroad. This dual identity could be a source of strength. On one side, she embodied the familiar customs of her people by birth, maintaining an invisible line of diplomacy between her native land and her new kingdom. On the other, she projected herself as a devoted mother of heirs, a patron of local culture, and a visible supporter of her adopted dynasty. The tightrope was narrow, but those who walked it skillfully found themselves with influence in two courts at once. The suspicion toward foreign consorts was particularly sharp when their countries of origin were seen as rivals. In such cases, the consort was accused of advancing enemy interests, often without evidence. Every setback of the monarch's government could be blamed on the meddling of a foreign-born queen. The whispers might claim she favored her homeland's merchants, advised the ruler to sign disadvantageous treaties, or even conspired to weaken the army. Though often slander, these accusations reveal the recognition that consorts had the ear of the sovereign. Enemies feared them because their influence was real, even if the form it took was misunderstood. Yet not all foreign consorts suffered permanent suspicion. Many transformed their outsider status into a unique advantage. Precisely because they were not tied to native factions at court, they could sometimes act as neutral brokers, smoothing disputes among competing noble families. Their foreignness gave them a kind of detachment that allowed them to maneuver where native-born courtiers were paralyzed by old feuds. By establishing networks of patronage that included both natives and trusted foreign allies, such consorts carved out spaces of authority that were theirs alone. When examining the effects of these marriages, one finds striking contrasts. Some unions were genuine bridges of peace. A princess sent to a rival kingdom could soften decades of hostility. Her presence at court, her letters to her natal family, and her influence over her husband could transform enemies into allies. Children born of such unions embodied the union of two realms and made war between their grandparents and uncles less likely, for no dynasty wished to fight itself. These marriages did not erase all conflict, but they created bonds that made peace possible. On the other hand, some marriages of state did the opposite, sowing tension rather than calming it. A consort who clung too closely to her native traditions or openly advanced the interests of her birth family could fan the flames of suspicion until they burst into open hostility. A match that was intended to end wars could instead plant seeds of distrust that poisoned diplomacy. In such cases, the consort became a symbol of division, not unity, and her marriage, despite its initial promise, was remembered as a miscalculation. The difference between peace and discord often lay in the personal abilities of the consort. A woman who could win hearts, learn languages, and show loyalty might turn suspicion into admiration. A woman who seemed aloof, proud, or dismissive of her new people could confirm the worst fears of her critics. Thus, the personal character of individuals carried consequences for entire nations. Dynasties and ministers might plan the alliances, but the consort's ability to embody them determined whether they flourished or failed. History preserves examples of both outcomes. There were consorts who became beloved national figures, remembered not as foreigners, but as mothers of the nation, patrons of art, or defenders of faith. Their marriages achieved what diplomats had hoped, a genuine weaving together of two peoples. But there were also consorts who became lightning rods for resentment, accused of favoritism, corruption, or betrayal. Their marriages hardened divisions rather than healed them, showing that no diplomatic calculation could succeed without the human skill to carry it forward. When one considers the sheer scale of these alliances, it becomes clear how central consorts were to the making of Europe, Asia, and beyond. Borders shifted not only because of battles, but also because of weddings. Thrones were united or divided through the children of these unions. The rise and fall of empires often followed the logic of marriage as much as the logic of conquest. Each time a consort entered a foreign court, she carried within her the possibility of peace war, stability, or chaos. This reality complicates the tendency to view monarchy as a matter of singular rulers. A king or queen did not act alone. Their choices of spouse, often arranged for them, could define the course of their reign. And once the marriage was made, the consort's role continued to shape events in ways both subtle and dramatic. To study monarchs without their partners is to misunderstand the very machinery of power in an age where family ties were the foundation of politics. What is remarkable is how little of this appears in standard histories. The grand battles are recounted in detail, the proclamations studied, the ministers catalogued. Yet the marriages that underpinned those battles, and the consorts who navigated suspicion or wielded influence, remain in the background. It is almost as if historians were reluctant to admit that intimacy and personality mattered as much as strategy and armies. But the truth is that behind treaties and campaigns were the private conversations of couples whose union was meant to embody alliances greater than themselves. In this way, the crown's shadow extended far beyond the sovereign. It enveloped the consort who stood at the sovereign's side, who shared the burdens of rule and bore the scrutiny of subjects. Whether beloved or hated, these consorts were never insignificant. They were the living proof that monarchy was not only about crowns and scepters, but also about families and marriages, about the weaving of personal lives into the destiny of nations. As one moves through the history of kingdoms, one finds countless moments where the fate of realms hinged not on swords alone, but on wedding vows. The subtle hands of consorts, guiding, advising, and embodying alliances, shaped the world in ways still felt today. Their influence may have been hidden, but it was real, profound, and enduring. The crown may have glittered on the ruler's head, but its shadow stretched across the partner who shared the throne, making the consort not merely a companion, but an architect of power. From these unions of state, a natural question follows. Once the consort was established in court, how did she or he continue to shape policy on a daily basis? The answer lies not in public audiences or official councils, but in private rooms, quiet conversations, and the invisible theater of influence that unfolded away from ministers and courtiers. The consort possessed something few others did: uninterrupted access. A sovereign could refuse to meet a noble or delay an ambassador, but he or she could not avoid the presence of a spouse who dined at the same table, shared the same bed, and inhabited the same palace corridors. The drawing room, the bedchamber, or the private garden became places where policy was quietly discussed, decisions shaped, and hesitations turned into resolve. This art of the private audience was delicate. A consort could not lecture a sovereign as a minister might, nor could they present memoranda like secretaries. Their power lay in tone, timing, and suggestion. A single remark at the right moment could linger in the ruler's mind, resurfacing during a council meeting and tipping the balance of judgment. If a sovereign raged with anger against an enemy, the soothing words of a consort in the quiet of the evening might transform fury into caution. If hesitation plagued the ruler's mind, the consort's encouragement could embolden action. These moments were invisible to the official record, yet they explain much that otherwise appears inexplicable in history. The intimacy of this influence also made it uniquely powerful. Unlike ministers who advanced their own careers, a consort could claim to speak with disinterested loyalty, as a partner who cared for both the ruler and the realm. Of course, consorts often had their own agendas, protecting their children's succession, advancing their natal families, or shaping policy according to personal convictions. But the intimacy of their relationship gave their words an aura of trust. This was a form of persuasion few others could wield. Beyond private counsel, consorts also commanded influence through patronage. Royal courts were intricate ecosystems where careers rose and fell according to favor. A nod from the sovereign was decisive, but a word from the consort could open doors, grant audiences, or secure appointments. Many ambitious courtiers and artists quickly realized that pleasing the consort was a path to advancement. To win her or his favor was to gain a channel to the ruler's ear. Through this web of patronage, consorts created networks of loyalty that extended across the court. This patronage was not only political but cultural. Consorts often became the protectors of artists, musicians, scientists, and writers. Their tastes shaped the cultural identity of entire reigns. A queen who admired painting might summon foreign masters to court, changing the artistic style of her adopted land. A prince consort who loved science might fund observatories or universities, leaving behind a legacy of intellectual achievement. These acts were never entirely apolitical. By supporting certain arts or ideas, consorts projected images of refinement, authority, and continuity that strengthened their own position. They turned culture into propaganda, presenting themselves as enlightened, pious, or heroic according to the needs of the moment. The connection between patronage and propaganda was especially strong in times of crisis. When suspicion fell on a consort for being foreign or overly influential, patronage became a weapon of survival. By supporting religious institutions, funding charities, or commissioning works that celebrated national traditions, the consort could refashion their public image. A painting that depicted the queen as a nurturing mother, or a performance that portrayed her as a defender of the faith, could shift public sentiment in her favor. These images were not merely decoration, they were tools of power. In this sense, consorts excelled at wielding what one might call soft power, though contemporaries rarely used that phrase. Unlike armies and treasuries, which belonged to the ruler, consorts specialized in diplomacy, charm, and personal relationships. They cultivated friendships with courtiers, corresponded with relatives in foreign lands, and charmed visiting ambassadors. Often, the success of negotiations owed less to formal councils than to the conversations held over banquets, in hunting lodges, or in private chambers where the consort acted as mediator. The personal warmth of a consort could ease tensions that no treaty alone could resolve. There are many accounts of ambassadors reporting home not only the words of the ruler, but also the attitudes of the consort. Diplomats knew that a smile or frown from the consort could reveal more about the direction of policy than a dozen official decrees. Foreign powers therefore courted consorts as carefully as they courted sovereigns. Gifts, flattery, and secret correspondence were common methods of winning favor. In turn, consorts often played this role with skill, balancing loyalty to their spouse with the subtle advancement of their own agendas. The strength of this soft power was that it operated in spaces that official structures could not reach. Ministers negotiated treaties, but consorts hosted balls where foreign envoys were softened by music and laughter. Generals planned campaigns, but consorts wrote letters to relatives across borders, maintaining bonds of kinship even in times of tension. By weaving together personal relationships, they created invisible ties that underpinned the visible machinery of state. This influence also extended to shaping the moral and emotional tone of a reign. A consort who embodied piety could reinforce the ruler's connection to the church. A consort who modeled elegance could elevate the prestige of the court. A consort who was approachable and generous could soften resentment against taxation or military burdens by presenting the monarchy as compassionate. None of this required direct command. It relied instead on image, presence, and the ability to win hearts. The ability of consorts to navigate these roles was not uniform. Some were natural diplomats, skilled in conversation, and quick to see the value of alliances. Others were shy or withdrawn, and their lack of engagement limited their power. Some wielded patronage wisely, balancing the interests of different factions, while others concentrated favor too narrowly and provoked jealousy. The successes and failures of consorts were as varied as their personalities, but the pattern remains. Their role mattered, and their presence left a mark on policy and culture alike. The influence of consorts also illuminates a broader truth about monarchy. While crowns and scepters symbolized absolute authority, the reality of rule was much more relational. It was not enough for a sovereign to command armies or collect taxes. They also had to maintain legitimacy, inspire loyalty, and manage the delicate balance of court politics. In all these tasks, consorts were essential allies. They could whisper advice in moments of doubt, soothe public unrest through charity, and knit together factions through careful patronage. Their power was subtle, but it was indispensable. One might be tempted to dismiss these roles as secondary compared to the dramatic decisions of war and peace. Yet when viewed in total, the consort's influence becomes undeniable. Without their steady counsel, many sovereigns might have acted rashly. Without their patronage, cultural achievements that defined entire eras might never have emerged. Without their soft power, diplomatic bridges might have collapsed into conflict. Theirs was a power that did not always seek recognition, but it was power nonetheless. This long history of influence reveals why the study of monarchy must move beyond the glittering crown itself. Power resided not only in the throne room, but also in the drawing room, the private chamber, and the salon. There, in spaces often dismissed as domestic or trivial, The destinies of nations were quietly debated and sometimes decided. The consort, far from being a passive figure, stood as a co-architect of power, shaping the course of events with whispers, favors, and gestures that rarely made it into official chronicles but nonetheless altered the world. To overlook these figures is to misunderstand monarchy itself. Rulers were never alone, and their choices were never wholly their own. At their side stood partners who shared their burdens, ambitions, and fears. In their shadow, these consorts reshaped dynasties, policies, and cultures. Their influence may have been soft, hidden, and difficult to measure, but it was constant. It was the quiet force that steadied crowns and altered the flow of history. And so, when one gazes upon portraits of monarchs adorned with jewels and robes, one must remember that behind the paint lies a story more complex than a single sovereign. Standing just outside the frame, sometimes invisible, sometimes faintly present, are the consorts whose whispers guided decisions, whose patronage molded culture, and whose presence embodied alliances. They were the unseen architects of power, and the shadow they cast was as enduring as the crown itself. Yet there were moments when whispers and subtleties were not enough. History is filled with crises in which the sovereign could not act, through absence, captivity, illness, or death. And in those voids, consorts stepped forward to seize the reins of power. These periods of regency are among the clearest demonstrations of how consorts were not simply companions, but rulers in their own right, albeit often without the formal title. When a king died leaving a child heir, or when a monarch was incapacitated, it was frequently the consort who became guardian of the crown, entrusted or forced to hold authority until stability could return. Such regencies were never easy. A consort acting as regent faced suspicion from nobles who feared overreach and from foreign rivals who saw weakness. To govern as regent required balancing firmness with caution, proving that one could command loyalty without overstepping into tyranny. Some consorts rose brilliantly to the challenge, maintaining order and protecting their child's inheritance. Others faltered, overwhelmed by intrigue or driven to excess. But each regency revealed a truth often ignored. Consorts were capable of leadership that equaled, and sometimes surpassed, that of the sovereigns they replaced. Beyond regencies, there were even bolder moments when consorts defied or displaced the very rulers to whom they had been joined. The image of a passive spouse collapses when confronted with stories of queens and princes who challenged their partners, manipulated court factions, or even orchestrated coups. In some cases, they acted to defend themselves or their children from a dangerous sovereign. In others, they pursued power for its own sake, unwilling to remain in the shadow when they could command the light. These acts of defiance stand as reminders that monarchy was never a simple hierarchy. Within the palace itself, the throne was contested ground, and consorts were often among the most formidable contenders. The ambition of consorts also extended across generations. A single reign might be fleeting, but the vision of dynastic dominance required patience that stretched beyond one lifetime. Many consorts played a long game, working not only for their own children's advancement, but for the enduring supremacy of their bloodline. They arranged marriages that secured future crowns, guided the education of heirs to shape their policies, and forged alliances that bore fruit decades later. Their strategies were rarely recognized in their own time, yet their impact could echo through centuries, ensuring that their descendants sat upon thrones long after their own deaths. Consider the position of a widow who became regent for her young son. In that moment, she was both mother and monarch, defender of her child's rights and the state's stability. Her actions could determine whether her dynasty survived or was swept away by rival claimants. Letters from such regents often reveal the intensity of their burden, negotiating with nobles, arranging military defenses, and securing international alliances, all while enduring criticism that a woman should not hold such power. Yet many succeeded, proving themselves astute leaders who safeguarded their dynasties through the most perilous of times. There were also cases when consorts ruled not only in their children's names, but in their own. A few turned regencies into personal reigns, exercising authority so fully that their governance shaped the realm even after the heir came of age. Ministers who sought to sideline them often found themselves outmaneuvered, for a consort regent wielded the legitimacy of both blood and circumstance. These episodes expose how fragile the supposed absoluteness of monarchy was. A crown might rest on one head, but its power could be wielded by another hand. The stories of rebellion and dethronement push this reality further. There are accounts of consorts who allied with discontented nobles to remove their own spouses. Some did so to protect themselves from cruelty, others to defend their children, and still others out of sheer political ambition. The notion of a consort as submissive collapses entirely when faced with tales of queens who orchestrated palace coups or princes who sidelined their reigning wives. Though scandalous to chroniclers, such acts underline the fact that monarchy was as much about competition within the palace as it was about external wars. These struggles were not confined to Europe. Across Asia, Africa, and the Americas, one finds parallel examples of royal spouses who assumed leadership when the sovereign was absent or weak. In kingdoms from West Africa to imperial courts in China, empresses, queen mothers, and principal wives commanded loyalty and steered policy. Sometimes they were revered as protectors of the dynasty. Other times they were feared as usurpers. In all cases, they illustrate the universal truth that proximity to power creates opportunities to seize it outright. The long game of power reveals itself most clearly in the genealogies of dynasties. Marriages arranged by consorts often linked houses across borders, creating chains of kinship that stretched over centuries. A consort might not live to see her granddaughter ascend a foreign throne, but it was her careful planning that made it possible. These interwoven alliances meant that the ambitions of one generation became the realities of another. The consort who seemed merely to arrange her children's marriages was in fact designing the political map of future Europe, Asia, or Africa. What stands out is the patience required for such strategies. A minister might seek immediate gain. A general might pursue a swift victory. But consorts often thought in decades, measuring success not by today's treaty, but by tomorrow's succession. They invested in education, religious patronage, and marriage negotiations, knowing that the full harvest of their efforts would only be reaped long after their own deaths. In this sense, they were builders of dynastic legacies more enduring than many of the rulers whose names dominate chronicles. These patterns of regency, rebellion, and dynastic planning reveal that consorts were not accidental participants in history. They were central actors, capable of wielding authority in moments of crisis, defying even the sovereign, and shaping the future of entire dynasties. To imagine monarchy without them is to imagine a stage where half the cast has been erased. The crown glittered in public ceremonies, but its shadow stretched into every private chamber, every regency council, and every dynastic plan whispered in the night. The story of consorts is the story of hidden architecture. Their influence could be soft and persuasive, whispered in a bedchamber, or hard and uncompromising, enforced through regency or rebellion. It could be immediate, altering a sovereign's decision in a single moment, or stretched across generations, ensuring dynastic dominance long after their deaths. They may not have been crowned in their own right, yet they wore the invisible diadem of influence that shaped nations. To understand history fully, one must look not only at the sovereign who sat upon the throne, but also at the consort who stood beside them, sometimes whispering, sometimes ruling, sometimes overthrowing, and sometimes patiently weaving a future they would never live to see. These were the unseen architects of power, their shadows as enduring as the crowns they supported, contested, and sometimes seized for themselves. The question then arises of what remains after their lifetimes. If many consorts worked in secrecy, if their greatest acts were hidden in private chambers or encoded in dynastic arrangements, how can their legacy endure? Yet the evidence lies in the very shape of modern monarchies, in the traditions that persist today, and even in the political cultures of nations that have long abandoned thrones. The legacy of consorts stretches beyond lineage. It endures in institutions, cultural practices, and in the very idea of what power means. The first measure of this enduring influence is dynastic continuity. Generations of monarchs owe their thrones not simply to the sovereigns of old, but to the consorts who fought, plotted, and strategized to secure the inheritance of their children. When one traces a family tree of any great dynasty, one finds not only rulers but mothers and fathers whose determination ensured survival in times of peril. The survival of certain royal lines, despite crises of succession, rests upon the stubborn resolve of consorts who refused to let their children's rights be erased. That determination echoes in every modern royal ceremony where continuity is celebrated, for the very existence of those lines is a monument to consorts' unseen labor. But their legacy is not only genetic, it is also cultural. The patronage of consorts shaped the art, architecture, and intellectual life of entire civilizations. palaces adorned with frescoes, cathedrals resplendent with stained glass, and libraries filled with manuscripts often owe their existence to the initiative of consorts. These cultural treasures became part of national identity, symbols of continuity that outlived the reigns of particular rulers. Even now, tourists walking through galleries or cathedrals are, without knowing it, encountering the visions of queens and princes whose influence was once dismissed as secondary. In political traditions, too, their legacy is visible. Many ceremonial roles assigned to modern consorts in contemporary monarchies, the hosting of charities, the patronage of education and health institutions, the symbolic presence at public events, are echoes of the past. Though today these roles are presented as symbolic or supportive, they carry with them the memory of a deeper, older function. Consorts once wielded genuine power in similar spheres, and even stripped of formal authority, the outlines of that influence remain. When a modern consort champions a humanitarian cause or quietly advocates for social reform, they walk in a path paved centuries earlier by predecessors who used patronage and soft power to mold their societies. The political landscape of the present also retains the imprint of historical consorts in subtler ways. In many modern states, the idea that influence need not be formal to be effective owes much to the precedent set by royal consorts. Their mastery of persuasion, diplomacy, and image has become a model for political spouses, advisors, and figures who operate outside official office yet shape decisions at the highest level. The legacy of consorts thus extends into republican as well as monarchical contexts. Presidents' spouses, prime ministers' partners, and influential confidants today reflect the same pattern: access, intimacy, and soft power shaping the choices of leaders. This enduring pattern challenges us to redefine what power itself means. Historians once equated power with overt rule: crowns, parliaments, armies, and decrees. But consorts show that influence can be profound without being formal. The ability to counsel, persuade, stabilize, and embody continuity is a form of power no less real than commanding armies. Indeed, in many cases it proved more lasting. Armies were defeated, laws repealed, but the dynastic continuity or cultural identity secured by consorts endured. To see power only in terms of visible command is to miss the intricate webs of persuasion and symbolism that hold societies together. Consorts demonstrate that leadership is not always about domination, but often about mediation, inspiration, and endurance. Their legacy reminds us that history is not only made by those who issued commands, but also by those who shaped the context in which commands were given. This redefinition has important modern resonance. In an age when influence often comes through media, diplomacy, and public image rather than brute force, the lessons of consorts seem more relevant than ever. Modern leaders are judged not only on policy, but on the narratives and symbols surrounding them, and partners or close confidants play a crucial role in shaping those narratives. The distinction between official authority and soft power, so central to the history of consorts, is now a defining feature of global politics. One can also trace their legacy in how societies think about marriage and leadership. The union of sovereign and consort embodied the blending of private and public life, the intertwining of intimacy and statecraft. That model persists today, where the personal lives of leaders are inseparable from their political image. The idea that a partner's conduct, values, and presence can strengthen or undermine a ruler is centuries old, rooted in the long history of royal consorts. Even the criticisms directed at modern political spouses mirror those aimed at historical consorts. Charges of undue influence, favoritism, or meddling echo the accusations once leveled at queens and princes who were perceived as interfering in governance. The persistence of these themes shows how deeply ingrained the figure of the consort remains in political imagination, even when thrones have disappeared. At the same time, the legacy of consorts offers a lesson about resilience. Many of them endured suspicion, xenophobia, or attempts to erase their influence, yet they carved out roles that proved indispensable. In the modern world, where marginalized voices still struggle for recognition, their stories provide inspiration. They remind us that influence often comes not from occupying the most visible seat, but from finding ways to shape events despite exclusion. Their endurance also raises a broader question about the writing of history. For centuries, their names were footnotes, their contributions minimized. To recover their legacy is to challenge a narrative that equated power only with official office. It is to recognize that influence can reside in unexpected places, and that the true architects of history are often those whose work was hidden in the shadows. The persistence of royal households today, even in constitutional monarchies where sovereigns have little direct power, underscores how the symbolic roles of consorts remain vital. Crowds still gather to see them, media still scrutinize their actions, and governments still rely on their presence to project continuity and stability. This is not a relic of the past, but a living continuation of a pattern that began centuries ago when consorts first mastered the art of soft power. Their legacy thus bridges past and present, showing that the meaning of power is not fixed. It evolves, adapts, and reveals itself in forms that are often overlooked. From regencies that preserved dynasties to whispers that altered policy, from patronage that shaped culture to alliances that redrew borders, consorts have left behind a heritage of influence that continues to shape the world. In the end, the crown's shadow stretches not only backward through centuries of history, but forward into our own time. The unseen architects of power remind us that influence is not always loud, visible, or official. Sometimes it is quiet, patient, and enduring, carried in the legacy of traditions, institutions, and cultural memory. To study consorts is to be reminded that the history of power is richer and more complex than the chronicles of kings and queens alone. Their stories invite us to reconsider what it means to shape history. They show that authority can lie in counsel as much as in command, in patience as much as in conquest, in continuity as much as in change. And they leave us with the enduring truth that every crown casts a shadow, and within that shadow, unseen yet essential, stood the consorts whose influence continues to resonate long after their names have faded from the page. It is perhaps for this reason that even now, centuries after many of these figures walked the halls of palaces, their stories continue to grip the imagination. There is something compelling in the way their power was at once so great and yet so carefully disguised, in the way they navigated courts rife with suspicion and intrigue, and in how they left marks upon history that are still visible despite efforts to minimize their roles. The fascination lies not only in the drama of their lives, but in the larger truths they reveal about how human societies function, how influence is exercised, and how stories are told. Part of the allure comes from the contrast between their public image and their private reality. Official portraits present them as serene companions, elegant figures draped in jewels, their hands resting demurely by their sides. But letters, records, and the consequences of their choices tell a different story, of shrewd negotiators, subtle strategists, and determined parents who understood that the survival of their families and their nations depended on their skill. To glimpse beneath the polished surface is to discover a hidden history, one that feels almost like uncovering a secret code written into the past. That sense of revelation continues to captivate audiences who seek stories that challenge the straightforward narratives of kings and battles. Another reason these figures continue to fascinate is that their stories are deeply human. While sovereigns were often treated as semi-divine, consorts lived closer to the paradox of being both public and private, powerful and vulnerable. They faced xenophobia, suspicion, and the constant tension between personal desires and public duty. In their struggles, we see reflections of challenges that still resonate: how to balance partnership with independence, how to influence without overstepping, and how to endure in systems designed to minimize one's role. These dilemmas remain relevant in modern politics, workplaces, and personal relationships, giving their stories a timeless quality. There is also a dramatic quality in the way their influence often had to be exercised in the shadows. Open authority brings with it recognition, but hidden influence requires artistry. The skill to shape outcomes without appearing to do so, to weave alliances while avoiding blame, to steer a dynasty's course while leaving only faint traces of one's hand. This kind of mastery captivates the imagination because it speaks to the subtler forms of human power that exist everywhere, even today. We continue to marvel at how a whispered word in a drawing room might change the fate of a kingdom, just as in our own age we recognize how a private conversation can alter the course of politics or business without ever being recorded in official minutes. The fascination is also heightened by the tension between erasure and endurance. Many chroniclers of the past downplayed or ignored consorts, and yet their presence refuses to be silenced. Their names resurface in genealogies, their projects survive in architecture and art, and their fingerprints remain in political institutions. To rediscover them is to feel as if one is giving voice to the silenced, restoring balance to history. This act of recovery resonates strongly in a modern world increasingly aware of the need to hear voices once excluded, whether of women, minorities, or others pushed to the margins of official narratives. The story of Consorts is thus both historical and contemporary, a reminder of what was hidden and a model for how we might better understand power in all its forms. Modern audiences are also drawn to the lessons these stories teach about resilience. Many consorts faced hostility from the societies into which they married. They endured suspicion as foreigners, criticism as mothers, and dismissal as women or partners deemed secondary. Yet many of them prevailed, carving out spaces of influence and leaving behind enduring legacies. Their determination offers inspiration for those who face similar dismissals today, showing that it is possible to wield influence even when one is denied formal authority. Their ability to endure and shape history from positions of supposed weakness challenges our assumptions about what true strength looks like. The ongoing fascination is not only about admiration, however, but also about the warnings their stories contain. Some consorts fell into the traps of overreach, greed, or manipulation, and their downfalls serve as cautionary tales about the dangers of power used recklessly. The line between influence and control, between strategy and scheming, was always thin. Modern readers recognize in these tales the timeless risks of ambition unchecked, of using relationships for power without regard for trust or loyalty. Thus, the stories of consorts captivate not only because they inspire but also because they reveal the costs of misusing influence. Their relevance today is further underscored by the persistence of monarchy itself. In several countries, consorts still stand beside reigning monarchs, their roles carefully managed yet closely watched by the public. Media attention ensures that their actions, words, and even fashion choices are scrutinized, echoing the courtly gossip of centuries past. The fascination persists because we still see, in living form, the continuation of patterns established long ago. The modern consort, stripped of overt political power, nevertheless reflects the same questions. How to support without overshadowing, how to represent tradition while adapting to change, and how to navigate personal identity within the framework of public duty. Even beyond royalty, their stories resonate in political and cultural life. The influence of presidential spouses, prime ministers' partners, and powerful confidants mirrors the role of royal consorts, reminding us that proximity to power remains a force that shapes outcomes. To study historical consorts is to gain insight into the present, where influence continues to operate through relationships, persuasion, and image as much as through formal authority. At the heart of the fascination lies the broader question of what it means to exercise power in human society. We are accustomed to thinking of power in terms of armies, votes, and decrees, but the history of consorts reveals that influence is often quieter, subtler, and more enduring. Their stories teach us that true power may lie not in commanding, but in shaping the context within which commands are given, not in being seen but in being remembered, not in holding office but in securing legacies. As audiences reflect on these stories, they are reminded that history is not solely the tale of those who stood in the spotlight. It is also the story of those who worked in shadows, whose contributions were hidden yet decisive. That reminder is profoundly moving, for it suggests that influence is not limited to the few who hold visible office, but is possible for anyone who can master the arts of persuasion, patience, and vision. The fascination endures, then, because the stories of consorts are not only about palaces and crowns, but about the universal dynamics of human relationships. They reveal how love and duty, intimacy and politics, private desire and public necessity intertwine in ways that shape entire societies. They remind us that influence is not the property of a chosen few, but a possibility wherever human beings live together and make decisions. And they inspire us to look more closely at our own time, to ask who today shapes outcomes quietly, persistently, and without recognition. The ongoing allure of these unsung figures lies in the way they illuminate both the past and the present. They captivate us with their drama, inspire us with their resilience, warn us with their downfalls, and challenge us with their subtle redefinition of power. Their shadows still stretch across history, not as mere companions to sovereigns, but as architects of legacies that continue to shape the world. To tell their stories is not only to honor forgotten lives, but to gain insight into the nature of power itself. For as long as human beings remain fascinated by how influence works, by how the unseen can alter the course of nations, the tales of royal consorts will continue to captivate, offering lessons that are as relevant today as they were when crowns glittered beneath candlelit ceilings and whispers in the shadows changed the fate of kingdoms.